Welcome, everybody, to this podcast, Your Place or Mine, with me, John Goodall. I'm the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Hazlitt. I used to be on Country Life, but I'm now a visiting professor of architecture at the University of Cambridge and publisher of Triglyph Books, which I co-founded with the photographer Dylan Thomas.
This podcast is where we talk about buildings and history and people. And it comes on the back of the fact that Clive and I spend a lot of time looking at buildings, travelling around the country, and in the car afterwards, we often have rather fascinating discussions about what we've seen and how it all fits in.
And it's very fun, and we hope that some of that will be conveyed in this podcast, which we are calling, John,
Your Place or Mine.
Handle Wipe on Pod. Where are we today?
Today we thought we would have as our first episode a discussion of Pimlico, and there's a very particular reason for that, isn't there, Clive?
Because we're both, or we have both been associated. I still am associated with Pimlico. John used to live here. I still live here.
Yes, many moons ago I used to live here, and it's funny, it's a place that's changed, not out of recognition at all, but changed a great deal since I was here.
And we've just walked through it on a beautiful, crisp spring day. The extraordinary thing about Pimlico is that it's a relatively recent part of London in historical terms. It dates from the 19th century. What was there here before Pimlico, I wonder?
Well, before, in the Middle Ages, this is all property owned by Westminster Abbey. And we know that the Abbot of Westminster had his sort of country pad in the middle of what is now urban London, just on the Thames. It's called Lunate. And we actually have an image of one of the interiors of it, because at Westminster Abbey, the last freely elected Abbot of Westminster, who dies in 1532, John Islip, his roll shows the Abbot dying in his bedroom in the Chelsea Manor House, this Pimlico Manor House called Lunate, and it shows a fashionable room with the Abbot in his bed, with the bed curtains hanging down, and a room hung with tapestries, and monks singing prayers at his deathbed. It's a really rather amazing image, and that's still, the role that has this image is still at Westminster Abbey.
And that would have been on the Thames, wouldn't it, John?
That is right on the Thames, where every fashionable residence of the Middle Ages is placed, because good for transport and good, your gardens can drop down to the Thames and you can take water transport into town or to Westminster. And of course, yes, the King at Westminster, Archbishop of Canterbury, immediately opposite in Lambeth Palace. And then just around the corner is the Abbot of Westminster.
And we're here very near Westminster Abbey.
We are,
really?
In fact, we're within
about half a mile, I suppose.
and within easy sound of the bells, aren't we?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
But it's difficult to rescue today the sort of low, marshy landscape that must have existed here. I mean, presumably Lunate is a little kind of island within a low-lying area of land with gardens around it and a fashionable manor house, but much of this is just open countryside and very marshy, which is something we'll be talking about again, because it's crucial to how it's developed,
Absolutely
isn't
crucial.
it?
But by the 18th century, or the early 19th century, I think that name, Lunate, had become the Neat Houses Gardens.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? So,
which were sort of laid out. They were market gardens, which served the rest of London, but when you look at the map, you can see they're laid out on a geometrical basis. So they're places that people could stroll around. I think there were pubs and stuff where you could refresh yourself, and this has become a bit of a place of resort, but sort of gardeny and market garden.
And again, it's slightly out of the way, isn't it? Because London has developed the West End along Piccadilly. So you've got the city, you've got Westminster as a settlement in its own right, with the law courts, Parliament, all the places where MPs need to stay, and this is on the periphery of all that, but it's just beginning to edge into fashion as London expands. And of course, the crucial event that transforms this is the decision by the Prince Regent George IV to move his palace to Buckingham House, which we now know as Buckingham Palace, because that is transformative in the early 19th century of the status of this part of London. It switches the development of London from north of Green Park to south of Green Park, where Buckingham House, Buckingham Palace is. And really the story of Pimlico then follows on from that transformation, doesn't it?
Yes. And the Grosvenor family, who owned a lot of the land around here, have a complete windfall. They acquired it as a sort of farm by marriage, I think, in the 18th century. And so they're sitting on this land, and suddenly it becomes the prime real estate.
Because
London.
everyone wants to be near this
Yes.
new, and I think it's important to say, really imperial palace in a way. You know, that Buckingham House is obviously, it's a much older building, but it's about to be transformed into the seat of a monarch who claims to be the most powerful monarch in the world. This point that in the early 19th century, Britain is full of brash confidence, and the wealthy in Britain are wealthier than people anywhere else in the world.
No, there's a certain feeling of America de nos jours.
Yeah, no, dare we say it, yes. And with all the irritation that causes other people and all the extraordinary self-confidence it
Enormous
brings with it.
self-confidence and this sudden concentration of vast wealth in private hands, of whom the Duke of Westminster, who was a Grosvenor from this very rich family, from the family who owned all this land, he became enormously rich.
And also the sense that London needs to be an imperial capital. You know, that Britain has just vanquished all her enemies in the first quarter of the 19th century, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It's conscious of this enormous empire that it's secured for itself. London is becoming, for the first time, a self-consciously imperial capital. And there are so many things that are going on in this period, in the first quarter of the century, which are transforming the capital into an imperial city. And the king is, and the Prince Regent, and as George IV, is crucial to that process.
But I think it's time to introduce...
Oh no, just down to Pimlico, a little tiny corner of this.
No, I'm going to suggest it's time to introduce a very exciting character
Oh yes.
into this story, who was a titan of the era called Thomas Cubitt.
Indeed. So, yes, tell us, Clive.
An extraordinary man.
Yeah,
Well, he was an amazing man. He was a sort of Regency character, early Victorian, but he's thought of as being a Victorian because he had this titanic energy. And he was really extraordinary. He was the son of a carpenter in Norfolk. And the turning point in his early life was that he made a single voyage to India with the East India Company. And he came back with enough goods that he could trade to have some capital. And he reinvented the way that people built houses in London, or indeed across the country. Because the way they'd done it in the Georgian period was craft-based. A little group of craftsmen who would go in, they were often related and families. All these craftsmen would work in the house together. It was, it built Georgian London, but it was inefficient. What he introduced was the separation of all these trades, and he employed them directly himself.
Yes, so you're going from a kind of cottage industry of building to a commercial industry of building.
I mean, almost factory principle in a sense, because you were separating out all these different processes. So you didn't have the carpentry and the masonry and the tile work or whatever it was all going on together.
And it is important to say, isn't it, that yes, London there have been big developers in London before. In fact, already by this date, the threshold for developing things in London at scale is very considerable. That landholders here are in partnership with builders, parceling up blocks of land, creating new streetscapes, and London is expanding at an astonishing rate. But there is now an overlay of all kinds of other things. There's the prosperity of London, its political significance, the sense that it's taking on a new form. And I actually think, again, going to the big picture, I think George IV is very conscious of the Emperor Augustus, finding Rome brick and leaving it in marble. And I think that there is an aesthetic of this period, which Pimlico perfectly expresses, of the stucco frontage. This is a plaster frontage that makes buildings of brick, which we're going to talk about later, look as though they're actually made from cut blocks of the finest stone. And of course, this is a major shift. Georgian London has, after the rebuilding of the Fire of London in the late 17th century, London turns red from brick, but in this period it's about to turn a different colour of brick, but also all the smart bits are beginning to be overlaid with stucco to turn it into a look-alike of marble.
Yes, or indeed Bath stone. And they're sometimes, I think, painted a sort of sandy colour.
Indeed, with this,
and then it was scored.
And scored.
this plaster had lines drawn in it to make it look as though they were ashlar blocks.
Indeed, so it's to make it look like cut stone, isn't it? And all the bits of London that belong from the, let's say, the 1790s through to the first quarter of the century, you can identify them immediately because they tend to be finished in this stucco. And then as time goes on, Portland stone begins to take over and London goes white. So it's a really interesting
Well, of course, it didn't
progression.
stay white very long because it was so dirty.
Yeah,
Because there was
everything is
all
so
the smoke
filthy.
coming down, but they aspired to being white. But I think that it's important to underline that this wasn't an imperial project. This was private enterprise, wasn't it?
This is private enterprise.
And in a sense, the story of Thomas Cubitt, to revert to him, was like, it's a story more associated with America in a way. This person who came from nothing and ended up as a very big cheese indeed. In fact, he is closely related to people we know today.
In what sense? In who?
Well, let's leave that.
Okay, let's do
An exciting fact about Thomas Cubitt.
And you're quite right. It is important to make the point that this is a private initiative, but I think it's also important to point out that the private initiative sits beside Nash's remodelling of Regent Street, Regent Park for the Prince Regent.
Yes.
This is all happening within a period of 2 or 3 decades. So London is. It's important to remember that London is being completely reimagined. New institutions, buildings such as the National Gallery, the Royal Academy are being rebuilt. London is transforming itself, but you're absolutely right. Crucially and extraordinarily, considering its area, this is a duke partnering up with a builder and basically creating an entire district of London, which still has a very distinct character in consequence of the coherence with which it's planned.
Indeed.
What about so let's talk about what happened. I mean, I suppose for people who don't know London very well,
We might say where this is.
Where this is, exactly. It's useful, I think, just to think of it as being a bulge of land within the curve of the river, really.
Yes, that's
terminating
exactly what it
to
was.
one side with Westminster Abbey and with the palace, with Buckingham Palace sort of near the top of a triangle, and then it's graduating out into countryside in the 19th century.
And this was thought of very much as a piece with what is now Belgravia, which also hadn't been developed. And in fact, the term Pimlico, people don't quite know where it comes from. It might come from a pub, or it might be a hunting cry, people don't quite know. Or it might be a hunting cry which was used as the name of a pub.
Did you remember there was a very funny series of poems, spoof advertisement for polo mints on the Underground? I don't know if people remember, on Poems on the Underground. There were the poems that were put up in tube carriages, you could read them. And there was a series of spoof poems done, I think, for polo mints. And there was a haiku poem written by Pimlico. All of them were written by people. The names of the artists, the supposed artists, were all tube stations. And it made me laugh very much, because indeed it's a totally mysterious name. And
It's like the courtiers Ping and Pong in Turandot. I think we're straying into dangerous territory.
So anyway, we don't know where the name comes from. It is a weird name.
But it extended all the way up to Buckingham Palace. There wasn't Belgravia hadn't been invented in those days, and the whole of this big area was Pimlico. But what we think of as now being Pimlico is essentially on the wrong side of a big dividing feature, which was originally a canal. There was a waterworks which supplied water to the West End, which was sort of near Chelsea Bridge, where Chelsea Bridge stands now. But there was also a cut into this marshy land, and it was developed by the Grosvenor family into the Grosvenor Canal. And barges went up, and they offloaded coal. And so that was a big area. Canals went out of fashion. The railways came in. And when the railway came in, it went along that line, and Victoria Station was built on the site of the canal basin.
It's extraordinary that. It sort of explains how you could insert within this cityscape without destroying huge amounts of private property.
Yes.
I could insert infrastructure of the scale of Victoria and the line, London Victoria, and the lines running into it. It's completely extraordinary.
But this feature meant that there was always a divide between top and bottom. And indeed, you could literally say, because of the railway, that Pimlico is on the wrong side of the tracks.
Yeah, and I suppose it explains when you. I mean, if you look at a map, it's a regular grid, but it's like the spine, the canal. Those railway tracks now form a kind of spine, and all the roads are at slightly different angles.
Yes.
They sort of run across it, but there's a kink in them, isn't there?
Yes, yes,
So
it's confusing. It's very confusing because you think it's a grid and it's not really a grid. But it also takes into account various features that existed, not just the canal and later the railway, but there were one or two roads. For example, what is now called Warwick Way was a very ancient causeway, very dangerous, people being sort of held up and robbed or raped or whatever, on this causeway that went from Westminster to Chelsea and possibly beyond. But it was raised up above this marshy ground. So that was a pre-existing road which somehow had to be cut across this grid.
And the point is, isn't it, is that Belgravia and Pimlico are developed as part of a coherent redevelopment, but it starts on the right side of the tracks near Buckingham Palace, the redevelopment, yes, doesn't it? And then it's spreading south across Pimlico. And Belgravia is the really smart part of this redevelopment with an architect. Basavi is employed by the Duke of Westminster to lay out Belgrave Square, which is meant to be a group of houses around a titanic square. You know, the square is the building unit of late Georgian London, and
this is a huge square.
It's a huge square, and it's architect designed, and it's meant to attract people of the first social class from the West End to closer to Buckingham Palace, and it's the sort of. I think this is in the early 1820s, isn't it? And it's the beginning of this enormous development, which is going to steamroll across the whole, yes, of this area of Market Garden land. But the first thing that has to be done in all these cases is build the roads, isn't it? I mean, that's the process of development basically begins by creating the road network, doesn't it?
Yes. Or I think even before that, they had to raise the height of the land. And so this extraordinary titan of industry, Thomas Cubitt, arranged for barges. It's said that they came from St. Catherine's Dock, which was being dug out, to come to this Grosvenor Canal and offload hundreds of barge loads of rubble to put on all this marshy land to form a kind of solid base.
It up.
And in fact, this house that we are in today, which is part of this development. When I was considering having some work done to it, I had to find out what the foundations were like.
Discovered they didn't exist.
Discovered they didn't have any at all.
How very reassuring.
Yes, exactly.
Nothing to damage.
But as part of a terrace, we should say that these are all the houses are in the form of terraces, very traditional building, London building type. And so they sort of prop each other up, fortunately.
And I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it? I mean, the terrace is a very ingenious building unit, because it allows you to build lots of houses with regularly shaped rooms, but you can bring them all together. So instead of, as in a modern development with lots of freestanding buildings, you integrate them all together. They share party walls, but you can create an architectural unit big enough to do something really grand with. It's a way of creating sort of palatial fronts with multiple building units. And it's quite amusing, isn't it, walking round Pimlico today, yes, is you can see how someone has often conceived whole terraces as architectural units, but then individual owners have forgotten that their building actually forms part of a composition, and they've replaced the balustrade, or they've, yes, raised up a roof in a position that there shouldn't be a raised roof. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but it's...
Sometimes the individual houses are painted slightly different colours, which spoils the effect.
Which destroys the effect, which is meant to be that of uniformity,
yes,
but uniformity at scale, isn't it? It's a way of creating uniformity and building units of real scale to be impressive. And it is true that neighbouring houses borrow grandeur from each other, don't they? And they create a kind of overall effect, don't they?
Yes.
These long terraces of stucco, cut brilliantly bright on a morning like today.
I suppose it goes back to John Wood in Bath, who really did conceive the terraces of Bath to look like palaces. I think Cubitt wasn't quite so successful, even from the very beginning, possibly. But that was the idea, that it was a way of getting all these little houses. Well, not little. I mean, some of them are in Belgravia in particular, would we consider them to be pretty big. But individually, they would not have necessarily looked very impressive. But when they're all joined together, they had a critical mass.
I mean, it's worth saying, is it, that the terrace, obviously has a very deep history, and there are very imposing terraces in places such as Covent Garden from the 17th century, which are designed to create an overall effect, and that actually in Covent Garden is almost entirely overwritten now with all the changes that have taken place. But it's an earlier form. But as you say, somebody like Wood in Bath does create a completely. He changes the game in a way. There's a very funny
This palace facade.
Yes, and these use of complex geometric forms for the circus and all these things, which of course are part of a mad, imagined history of Stonehenge as being a Roman, of Roman origin, and linking all these things back to the design of the Temple of Solomon. I mean, Wood's perception of what he was doing and based on geometry is so peculiar now. I mean, it's almost, well, it is quite funny reading it now. I mean, it's a very eccentric vision of history.
It is.
But it persists. I mean, anyway, but that's by the by. But it does lead on very neatly, doesn't it, to the question of style. Should we deal with that in the second part, or should we deal with that now? Because that is really important.
Well, should we talk about how Cubitt achieved it? Because you mentioned the roads being built first.
Yes.
And that's a fascinating point, I think. I mean, Cubitt was this... He was extraordinary in his achievement. This Pimlico, he was in partnership with other people for Belgravia, this very aristocratic neighbourhood to the north. And Pimlico was always conceived for a different class of people. There are not very many muses which kept horses. This wasn't an area where people who owned their own horses and carriages lived. They were sort of taking the omnibus.
But you made this fascinating point, didn't you, when we were chatting just before this, that these houses in this period are defined by what they don't have socially. So if you don't have a muse, you're not keeping horses, you're a layer down. But also most of the houses in Pimlico don't have gardens.
No.
And that's, again, an indication of relative status, isn't it?
Yes.
You're moving downstream of the very grandest houses which do have these things.
Yes.
Are there other things what else? Those are the two principal things, would you say?
Well, that's true. I mean, essentially, they're a very much scaled-down version of the same sort of houses in Belgravia, and the plans are the same principles.
But just smaller.
As they are, just smaller. But they had to, before anything could be built, they had to build the roads. And so for a time, Pimlico was a kind of network of these elevated roads, because what we think of as being the ground level today isn't really the ground level. The ground level is where the basement is, which is where the marsh was, and where all these hundreds of barge loads of rubble had been dumped. And so to elevate it to the working ground level, vaults were built. They were very important in Victorian houses because, of course, everything ran on coal. London had millions of hearths, all burning coal. That's why it was so black and dirty. But the coal had to be kept in vaults. We use ours for storage now. It's very useful. But they run under these streets, and the streets were built on top of the vaults. And that was the first thing that was built.
It's difficult to imagine, isn't it, a landscape in which initially, presumably, you see these roads running with brick vaults being built on either side of them, like platforms, in preparation for the construction of houses, but hoardings and things for the works. It must have been a very, very peculiar site. I mean, I suppose you see photographs of 1960s developments in this form where the roads come first, but it's difficult to imagine it in something that feels so much older. But it must have been bizarre.
And on this gigantic scale, the Cubitt works were something that people came to see. They were a phenomenon of Victorian England.
They're on the Thames, aren't they? They're accessible on so there's a huge works yard on the site of Dolphin Square.
Yes,
is that right?
That's right. In the 19th century, things on the Thames, I mean, these palaces, such as the Abbot of Westminster's, had gone, and the edge of the Thames was used for sort of industrial uses and stuff, because, of course, people still brought supplies by barge. Cubitt, there was a terrible... making brick was a terrible occupation in the 19th century, but Cubitt did everything on such a scale that he didn't have little brickworks in the next street, so to speak, which is what had happened in Georgian London. because as Georgian London expanded, there were all these little brickworks, and it was terrible. The brickmakers were very well known for drunkenness and terrible bad behaviour, and it was a boom or bust sort of industry. But Cubitt's bricks all came from the Medway. He had a big, everything was being centralised, and they came along the Thames to this great Cubitt works, which employed 1,000 people.
What did it look like? It's kind of walled building yard, is it, with different materials?
Yes, and immense stables, because everything had to be taken along these roads elevated above the ground by great big Shire horses dragging carts, and so it's a scene of terrific industry.
And so there's big stables, no doubt stacks of timber. Piles of brick. You can mortar being.
Pimlico developed. Cubitt was a very clever person because he kept the squares, which never really. They were always quite smart, the squares in Pimlico, but the rest of the streets not so. And those were developed by little builders in units of 2 or 3 at a time, and they very often went bust, as builders famously have always done. But they bought the material that Cubitt was generating, the railings, and I should think the stucco detail, the bits that we're going to talk about in the second half of the.
So the whole operation is centralised to an extraordinary degree, isn't it? And it really it produces the uniformity that we see in the streets around us. It's an extraordinary. I think it is something that we underestimate today, where we live in a world of mass production. We assume uniformity, but in a world where everything else is being produced individually, I think uniformity has an extraordinary attraction that we can't really read anymore because we assume things are going to be uniform.
Yes. One of my neighbours said to me, well, of course, Pimlico is what Palladio would have liked to have done, but he couldn't do it on this scale.
He just couldn't build and build.
I thought an interesting point of view.
No, it is. Seeing streets on this scale all uniformly done, it is like Regent Street or something like that. There is something genuinely incredible about it, I think, to people who've not seen anything like this before. And even in London, it's a novelty. There are no. I suppose the Robert Adams building just off the Strand is the closest that anybody had got to that, and that was a project that nearly broke him, wasn't the Adelphi development, which nearly destroyed him financially. Quite incredible.
But despite being such an extraordinary commercial figure, because he had to do all these things like put together the sites, that was quite a difficult thing. He had to have a great financial aptitude as well as anything else. He was actually a nice man, wasn't he? Didn't Queen Victoria say something?
Well, we should
Shall we save that up?
The second part, because of course that's
we'll save up what Queen Victoria said.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, let's have a break.
We'll resume. Welcome back.
So we were this hanging question about Queen Victoria, but we were going to talk about Stan. It is bound up with that, isn't it?
Well, it is. And don't let me forget to tell you this important piece of information about Cubitt's great-great-great-granddaughter. Who is she?
Oh yes, who is that? Or are you going to hold this over yet further?
No, I think I'll tell you in case I forget to say later on.
It is.
But John, she is none other than the Queen of England.
How so?
Well, because she's his... Don't ask me for details.
No, that is a very surprising...
Cubitt. I don't know why Cubitt. I'm not sure he was even knighted, was he?
No, I don't. I'm pretty certain not.
I don't know. He was a modest man, really, because he never wanted to be described as an architect. He was always a builder. Whereas, of course, actually, he was stupendously successful. But the next generation became ennobled, didn't they?
Well, now this is beyond my knowledge, but that's fascinating. But based on his fortune, the fortune he makes, is that...
Yes.
So his building fortune basically castled...
Set them up. And they had a house, their house was Denby's, which is outside Dorking, of course, now a famous vineyard.
Gosh, what a fascinating...
But sorry, this is a distraction.
But that's a brilliant little piece of information, isn't it?
Who says there's no social mobility in Britain?
just takes a number of generations.
After 10 generations, you become Queen of England.
do virtually anything. Yeah, it works in reverse too. It's snakes and ladders, isn't it? Yeah, no. Well, I mean, there is, of course, a very close connection with the royal family through Cubitt, because he works for the royal family. And, I mean, one of the fascinating things is that Queen Victoria describes him in incredibly personal terms. I mean, she says he's one of the kindest and nicest people you could possibly imagine to meet. I mean, presumably he was on best behaviour when he met her. But even so, it was quite it's very surprising. I don't generally think of her as passing,
No, it was unusual.
flattering comments.
It was clearly heartfelt.
Yes. And there's a reason, isn't there,
Yes.
that's so close, because... we keep on havering as to who's going to introduce this. Should we talk about style first?
Well, we've both written articles on
But the style is the important thing, isn't
Yes,
it?
of
Because
course.
the style, and this is at the root of what makes these streets in Pimlico so special, is their sort of Italianate character. And it's a kind of Renaissance Florentine Italianate style. It's newly in fashion in the early 19th century. And crucially, the first sort of defining building in this tradition is built by Barry, the architect of the Palace of Westminster, who, as a very young man in 1828, wins a competition, an architectural competition, to design the Travellers' Club on Pall Mall.
Yes. And so when Belgravia and Pimlico were underway, this was absolutely the height of fashion, this style.
Indeed, we tend to think, of the Victorian age as loving Gothic, which is true, and Tudor-Beathan architecture, which is true. But I mean, in terms of sheer numbers of buildings constructed, I would have thought this Italian Renaissance style is probably the most prolific. I mean,
It's interesting. It had a very good run, and it was very highly regarded. For example, Clumber, this great palace built at the what was called, in fact, the Dukeries.
Indeed, in Staffordshire.
Staffordshire.
It is in Staffordshire.
For the Duke of Newcastle, that was... Do I mean the Duke of Newcastle?
Yes, you do. Yes,
A Duke, anyway.
it's just near
But that
Welbeck.
was-
It's a bit beside. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And so that was in this resplendent Renaissance style, which so there's a continuity. But of course, we're a bit before the Victorian period here, aren't we? In the 1820s,
We are,
the
but
start of it.
It is the start of it, but I mean, what's so interesting, I think it is worth saying, is what's so interesting about it is that it is a very cheap style, but one that can be made expensive very easily. So if you build in Gothic, you have to carve capitals, you have to make
Yes.
details and features, and that's quite expensive to do. The joy of the Italian Renaissance style is that you can build in brick, you can cover it in plaster internally and externally, you can create buildings which have repeated forms, appear uniform, but if you want to, you can also encrust them with sculpture. You can insert sculpture. You can build up the Italian Renaissance style very easily. It's also classical.
Not much sculpture around here, it has
No,
to be said.
but there's a lot of moulded
There's a
detail.
lot of moulded detail. That's
I suppose, and the point
lions'
is,
heads
and
and
things.
pediments, of course.
and the point is, it's subclassical as well, and that fits
Yes.
in with Britain's vision of itself as sort of new imperial capital. And the Pall Mall source of it is quite important, because Pall Mall is obviously, at the heart of this new imperial London, and Pall Mall is being deliberately redeveloped with club buildings because they're meant to be very, very grand structures. The Crown Estate
Yes.
is giving these off to clubs because they know that clubs will build on a very grand scale and help enforce the sort of grandeur, the civic grandeur of London. So it's a very influential building, but it's very funny also to think of Barry then immediately going off, in the next decade and designing the Palace of Westminster in, one of the biggest building ever constructed at that time, after the fire of 1834, but in this perpendicular Gothic style. So all these styles are coexisting, but that Renaissance style becomes meat and drink
Yes.
for these buildings. And there's a very important additional connection, because...
Yes. But before you get on to that, John, I just wanted to observe... I'm bursting.
Do be quick, Clive.
It was also something... The beauty of classicism is something that, because it's rather formulaic, it's something that somebody like Cubitt could do. Cubitt was not really a totally good architect, you couldn't possibly say that. And there are various sort of fudges and bodges around Pimlico, but because it's based on these repeating elements of windows, balconies, porches with columns, almost, well, not anybody could do it, but it could be done by somebody who wasn't very skilled as an architect and still achieve a good effect. So that's a virtue.
Indeed, and executing buildings on different styles, it's what you do on inside them that's important in a way, isn't it? If you want to display things, if you're a very rich aristocrat living in Belgravia, you can have a building like a balloon that's been blown up much bigger than one of these Pimlico houses, but you can ornament it very grandly, whereas these are, relatively plainly finished.
Yes. But you were going to say something, John.
Yes.
I interrupted you.
To finish, the other really important figure, of course, in this fascination with Florentine things is Prince Albert. So Prince Albert, on Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, they're having a large family in the 1840s. They want a family house outside London, and they are able to, by selling off the Brighton Pavilion and doing various other deals, they're able to buy Osborne on the Isle of Wight as a family holiday home. And they employ Cubitt.
It's an extraordinary choice, really.
It is, but
on the face of it.
On the face of it, but I think it is because Albert realises that if he has a builder, not an architect...
Oh yes, he can bully him.
He can take control of it. And Albert is himself fascinated by, the Renaissance. He and don't forget, there are lots of British people who see... the Britain's commercial empire as an evocation of the Florentine, Britain as a sort of second Florentine city, the merchants, princes. So there's a nice mixture here. That there's royal interest, there's a kind of zeitgeist awareness of Italy and England echoing Florence, and a bit of Rome and a bit of anything else that flatters itself, and. But Cubitt, as well as being a builder of these terraces, is also working first of all in the 1845 they buy Osborne, but then he's also involved in exactly the same period, a few years later, in building the new front of Buckingham Palace, which turns Buckingham Palace into a family house for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and then.
Cubitt was involved in that.
Cubitt, he's the builder, so it's done. Blore designs it and Cubitt builds it.
Wow.
But then, bizarrely, it's been pointed out that Cubitt seems to have done a suggested design for the remodelling of their Scottish house of Balmoral, which was not actually taken up. That's done by a Glaswegian architect in the event. But he does a Tudor-Beaton design for rebuilding Balmoral.
Gosh, so that was a bit out of his comfort zone.
And, bizarre. Also, I think Prince Albert really enjoys working with Cubitt because he's interested by the fire precautions that Cubitt is building into his buildings. There's these concrete floors which are incorporated within Osborne to prevent fire. So there are technical innovations that Cubitt is making that I think Prince Albert is totally fascinated by as well. So it's fascinating, this builder who's involved in royal commissions and then trickling all the way down to designing, houses for the middling sort in Pimlico. It's a weird combination of things.
And it seems extraordinary that Prince Albert chose this man who was, presumably how he knew him was that he was building these terraces just outside the garden of Buckingham Palace.
It is very strange, isn't it? It's a funny thing. One point when we were chatting beforehand that you also mentioned, I think it's worth saying, isn't it? Is if you were living in this part of London in, let's say, the 1850s or the 1860s, I think there would have been a striking difference in your experience of Belgravia, which is occupied by aristocrats and the very well-heeled in the season, and Pimlico, which is presumably a world working all year round. So that you would move.
Interesting. Yes, that's an interesting point.
You'd move, as it were. It's still sort of the case.
Yes.
The pavements of Belgrave Square are rarely churning with people, and all these embassy buildings and grand spaces.
It's a lonely place.
I think so.
Full of rich people who aren't there.
Who aren't there because they're somewhere else. Yes. And cafes and things like that are distinctly absent. Whereas this is a much more, I find. Be careful what we say about Belgravia, and otherwise we'll have enraged people saying this is much
Country
nicer.
life will have no readers.
But it's it's always been a sort of a busier and more human space with more going on.
And that's true. That's interesting. And of course, because basically, Pimlico was conceived as a middle class version of Belgravia, essentially.
Yeah.
But so it was conceived as a lower level, but it was never really the hit that Cubitt had hoped of it. Cubitt, as I think I said before, he kept the squares, and the squares always retained their value and to a certain extent fashionability, but the other streets, the sort of second and third grade streets, that wasn't the case. And so whenever the Grosvenor estate, which controlled Belgravia and maintained the tone very, very strongly, whenever it had to create social housing or something like that, it always got dumped in Pimlico, or if there was a sort of Salvation Army hostel that was needed. It never went into Belgravia. But as a consequence, we have an interest, it's always been mixed. And this gives it a vitality which conceivably Belgravia, because it's at a higher social level, but as a kind of monoculture of very rich people, that doesn't have this sort of mixed character.
And and that persists, doesn't it? I mean, the Pimlico basically, it doesn't exactly go steeply downhill, but I mean, it never makes it, and it rumbles.
I don't think it ever got to the top of the hill in some cases.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. If you take this very house that we're sitting in, which was built, which was built in 1851. Well, the records for this house, I think, have been eaten by rats, I was told. But we've got the records of the next door house. And a builder was living there. Well, that was probably, this is in the 1850s. I mean, builders did that. They built a house. They then lived in it for a bit so the plaster could dry and they would get a better return on it. But there were also people, they weren't people with very reputable employment. For example, there was someone described as the dispenser, well, that man meant the sort of chemist, who was working at the Millbank Penitentiary, which is almost next door where Tate Britain is. And, there were a lot of single women in these terraces. And there were people like, tailors and music teachers and so forth. There was an amusing description, which I must read. Am I allowed to read it?
No, you are. Well, if you read it.
Can't find it.
But the other thing is, there is a sort of source, partly of an explanation for this, is that, I mean, this also becomes an open sewer, doesn't it, latterly? Part of Pimlico. That's an important point to make, isn't it?
That's only true of this street. This street is called Tatchbrook Street. And when we first came here, which was over 30 years ago, I thought, well, this is obviously the name of one of those little rivers that goes into the Thames. Actually, that isn't true. It refers to a different episode in Pimlico's history, which was that with all these market gardens and things that there were here, there was also the nursery of Henry Wise, who was William III's
gardener.
I do mean William III. Yes, William III and Queen Mary's gardener. So he was using the trees that he was growing here
as a nursery
for Kensington Palace and things like that. So
and he came from Tatchbrook in Warwickshire.
And he came from somewhere called Tatchbrook. So there was no brook. There used to be a pub called the Royal Gardener. It's called something else now, but very unfortunately it had a sign showing Capability Brown, but it should really have had a sign showing Henry Wise, except nobody had heard of him.
It's unfortunate. And it should be said,
but there was.
So it should be said also that Tatchbrook Street, if you look at the grid, the Pimlico grid...
Oh yes, it's on a curve.
It's the one street that does this long curve, and that is because it is, in fact, running over a watercourse.
There was a watercourse. It wasn't called the Tatch Brook. It was actually a branch of the Tyburn. The Tyburn is a famous river. Tyburn was where people got hanged, which was sort of near Marble Arch somewhere. And it comes down from Marble Arch. You were saying about the Abbot of Westminster taking his water.
Yeah, well, incredibly, Westminster... I mean,
from Springs, I suppose, were they all...
Before the dissolution, of course, Westminster owns this enormous swathe of what is now central London. And the supplies of the water supply for Westminster Abbey came from a conduit in what is now Hyde Park. And in the 19th century, suddenly there are all these legal cases because the conduit, which has been operating since the Middle Ages, keeps on being broken by all these workmen doing work in between Hyde Park and Westminster Abbey. So the Abbey keeps on having its water supply cut. But in fact, that water supply is established, when this is all still, these are hunting parks. I mean, it goes right back.
So do you think it came from the Tyburn or from the spring?
Well, I think
there wouldn't have been a spring there, was there?
Well, I think there probably is. I don't know.
Well, there's springs all over the place. But I mean,
yeah. I mean, the Oxford Street is the Roman road coming out of London, and Tyburn is the hanging place, which is at the bifurcation of that street, and so in fact, again, you immediately realise how the bones of London are incredibly deeply buried in history.
Yes.
I mean, and in this curious way, they shape everything that comes afterwards, and it's bizarre, but that's another subject, really.
But the watercourse, as you referred to it, which came down
Pimlico.
down this street, as it became, was known as the King's Scholars Pond Sewer. And it had come down. It had come down from somewhere like Marble Arch through the West End, and it had collected a lot of very distinguished contents, which were distinguished but pretty smelly. And I think the King's Scholars Pond, I think, refers to Westminster School, and somehow there was a pond, I think probably where Vincent Square is. Anyway, it came along here, and it was a famous, sort of noisome offence to the public. And Cubitt had the problem of, what to do with this sewer. And so, being such a man of enterprise, he vaulted the thing over. He put it in the pipe and had it all vaulted over, and he created the street. But as a result, the street was rather broad. Before motor cars, it would have seemed very broad and airy, and he built terraces. But that's why it follows this curving line.
It's also a point worth making, isn't it, that cars, parked cars narrowed these streets. But again, to someone visiting here from anywhere in Europe in the early 19th century or mid 19th century, the streets here are extraordinarily broad, and they're very generously laid out.
I think it would have had a much more Italian effect for that reason. I think it would have had this generosity of scale, and in fact I think the architecture looks a bit better. I mean, what's happened in almost every case is that people have built above the cornice line. They've built an attic floor on with another to provide more rooms and things, which didn't exist in the Victorian period. So and that those additions going upwards have been done in a variety of manners, which has destroyed some of the unity.
But what's interesting is that even by the late 19th century, these houses are basically being broken up internally, aren't they, into lodgings. I mean, they're not.
Yes.
There are some which are in single family occupation, but many of them are being broken up and with multiple lodgers within the house. So have you found the quotation?
Yes, John, I'm bursting to read you this.
Okay, can I interrupt you? Carry on.
That's your prerogative, John Field. Anyway, there was a newspaper article of 1877 saying that Pimlico is the abode of gentility. A servant or two in the kitchen, which wasn't very many by Victorian standards, I suppose. Birds in the windows, with flowers in the boxes, pianos, and the latest fashions, of course. People are here always dressed at their best, and though not the cream of the cream, can show on occasion brougham and pairs and carriages and pairs, opera cloaks of surpassing gorgeousness, and dress suits that would satisfy Poole or Worth, the famous dressmakers, where people do not live on their property, i.e. having a private income. They are artists, very suspicious. They teach the piano, singing, dancing, drawing, languages, or are in the city. Well, of course, it wasn't an abode of gentility. It, as you were saying, John, it was.
It sounds sarcastic as a.
Don't
you think? I mean,
I think that's the way I was reading it. I'm not quite sure. Well, no, that's possibly it was a bit of a skit, because you couldn't possibly have thought all these artists, they're not creating an abode of gentility.
And they're earning their living.
People earning their living in a disgraceful way.
It drips with disdain, that description, doesn't it? I mean, but it's...
Well, even if it wasn't intended as a parody, I think that certainly it would have been read with great scepticism. As a matter of fact, and the other thing which the other literary, if I may just trespass on your attention for a moment, John, in one of the novels of Trollope, somebody who's advising a young wife who's married someone who's sort of enterprising but hasn't quite made it. And everyone's terribly worried about her. And they're house hunting. And she said, my dear, don't let him take you anywhere beyond Eccleston Square.
Because that's the
Eccleston
limit.
Square being the northern square in Pimlico. And obviously this grand lady was worried that her friend was going to be dragged down into some scruffy part of Pimlico,
Into the sinks
which was
of
going to be
Pimlico.
social death.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, it's slightly later, but I mean, the development of things south of London in Kennington. I mean, again, it's the squares there. They have much less stucco on there, and Dickens satirises them as places, that you really wouldn't want to live there. That they're somehow people just merely earning their crust.
Yes.
They're very. So I suppose there is. If you think of Buckingham Palace as being the central sun of the London universe, yes, and then basically as you move further and further south, it becomes less and less and less smart, and it's it's like a balloon that you gradually let the air out of. All the houses get by degrees smaller and smaller and smaller, but they're all essentially the same, aren't they?
Yes, by the time you got here, there was just a rude noise. I think that one of the things that Dickens would have had fun with was the fact that these houses, a sign of their having failed to take off, was that there were different families living in them. And, in Dickens's eyes, that was terribly funny because there were all these people, they were sharing a front door. They were kind of, they lived in houses which might outwardly have tried to look a bit grand. Actually, there are all these people going through the front door. The front door might have been left completely open because there are people living on different floors
within them.
And that was not a sign of success at all.
We ought to interject very quickly a sort of final comment about the initial development of it. I mean, the churches, which are a very prominent part of the development of Pimlico, aren't they? The way they're placed. I don't know a great deal about them. They're very grand buildings, but they tend to sit beside the squares, don't they? And
yes, they do.
And their design, it's not clear to me. They're presumably individually endowed. I don't know how that works.
I think I'm right in saying they were a gift of the Duke of Westminster.
So he builds the churches.
I don't think it was just the sites. I think it was probably the whole church. But he was this astonishingly rich man, and they're strikingly not in this Italian style. They're all Gothic-y, not very, not quite the best grade of Victorian Gothic. I mean, rather dull. Architects like Cundy were involved. Who's not a great name to conjure with.
But interesting architect designs.
Yes.
They have spires. They stand out very strikingly within this Italianate landscape.
Yes.
They're positioned in places where there are green spaces.
Yes.
They are the sort of focuses of the different vistas and the streets, aren't they?
Oh, yes, and you can imagine, I mean, they're on a great scale. Yeah. So you could imagine that a lot of people would have been going to church on Sundays and that they were a key anchor in the whole concept. But it was a sign that this particular area hadn't done very well, that in about 1870, a different sort of church was built, an absolute masterpiece of a church by George Edmund Street, and that's called St James the Less, and that's on Vauxhall Bridge Road, which is an older road. And it is in an Italian style in the sense it's Italy through the eyes of Ruskin, because it's in a brick style, but polychromy. It's very richly decorated inside.
And with fantastic iron railing. I mean, some of the railings and the exterior, the sculpture, the quality of the stained glass. I mean, it is an absolutely outstanding building. Yes. And if people listening have never been to see it, they really should. It's an extraordinary building with money poured out like water on it, and the surrounds, the sort of parish buildings around it, because it's a social project, isn't it?
Thing. Absolutely. And I would urge anyone to go, and also to give your £5, because there's a very brave undertaking to attempt to get all this wonderful craftsmanship back up into its pristine condition. And it's wonderful when you can see, it was all heated by coal, so it all got covered in coal dust. But when you can see bits of it that have been cleaned, you can see how striking it was, how this decoration just leaps out at you. It's marvellous. So when slowly that restoration project is completed, it'll be really magnificent. But it was built particularly in this area, it's just around the corner from here, because that was an area of complete destitution. It was almost like a mission.
Just thinking of, again, a contrast. I mean, Cubitt obviously builds Eaton Square as one of the first projects of the development of Belgravia, and there's a church, a great church on Eaton Square, burnt out but restored after the war. It's wonderful. Belgravia is otherwise entirely lacking in churches, if I'm not right. Is that right?
Well, there's one in Chester Square, isn't there?
Of course, there is actually.
But,
no.
I don't. And of course, there are ones like St Mary Bourne Street, which is a very high
I'm quite
Anglo-Catholic church. But that was a sort of mission church, wasn't it? That was a what do you call it? I've forgotten the word now, but a church which was belonged to a different church.
Oh, I
mean, what's the word for it?
No,
John, you know about churches.
You put me on the spot. Anyway, it's interesting, isn't it, to see the role of churches within. So you have these very uniform streets laid out on a grand scale, very wide, but the vistas are commanded by churches in a completely different style, different materials. They're all stone built, Gothic, but they are sort of the anchors of the landscape in this very uniform and originally very low build, actually. I mean, not by the standards of other cities of the time, but now within London, it's an extraordinarily low-built area, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. And one of the remarkable things is that it has retained quite a degree of integrity.
Yeah.
It's interesting that such a lot of Cubitt's terraces should have survived, not universal, but there's a critical mass, so it feels still as though the vision is Cubitt's. Which is remarkable because in the 20th century it went right downhill.
Yes, you were commenting before this, but I had forgotten about the Ealing comedy, Passport to Pimlico, which is all predicated on this absurd notion in post-war London that Pimlico, then by implication poor, working class, that a bomb reveals documents in a chest from the Duke of Burgundy that declare the independence of the manor of Pimlico, whatever it is, from the rest of England. And so in war-torn Britain, where everybody is on rations and things, Pimlico suddenly declares its independence and does everything exactly as it wants. And part of the comedy is the absurd idea that Pimlico, of all places, should be independent.
Because it is really a bit of a joke.
Yes.
And you can see from the... to be fair, it wasn't actually shot in Pimlico, as it happens. It was shot in Vauxhall. But, I mean, that's...
It was not... I didn't know that, really.
No, I think it's very similar. But because there were a lot of bomb sites and so on, for some reason, they found it more convenient to shoot in Vauxhall. So when I saw the film the first time, I kept on thinking, well, I live in Pimlico, but I can't recognise it. But that was the reason. But the world...
You never go to Vauxhall, is that
which is just over the river, for those who don't know. But the world that it showed is a world which has now completely vanished. Well, I suppose it's a long time ago, but, there are coppers on every street corner, and there are people doing sort of shady deals and having to run away, and, it's full of cheerful cockneys and things. This is a kind of London. I mean, I think, because Pimlico would now be regarded as quite central.
Yeah.
It's just on the edge. I mean, it's a 20-minute walk to Piccadilly and so on. The thought that somewhere which is so close to the centre of London could have been, so working class, I suppose, so uniformly working class.
And the point is, yes, many of these houses are by this stage divided up into boarding houses. It has a little bit of a reputation for itself. Is that true to say?
It's got a reputation. I don't think it's a very desirable
one.
Yes, you can see on buildings like this, you can see that there are often panels by the front door which conceal the fact that there are a lot of bells originally because people were living in different bedsies and
things within
the house. So that again, it was a sort of low grade kind of occupancy to the point that there was an estate agent who was famous for not pulling his punches and indeed advertising things, telling them as they were, so to speak. And he published an advertisement which later became the title of a book of his collected advertisements. And the advertisement was for a property, probably just like this one, which he put in under the title of Brothel in Pimlico.
An attractive prospect.
Yes, but I'm afraid that's something that Pimlico was famous for. Because it was just on the edge of this, Belgravia was still very posh and grand. And so these nefarious activities took place in the part where property was cheap.
And that partly explains why...
And it's near Victoria Station. You know, stations always attracted these.
Yes, but it also explains why large areas of Cubitt's grid were then demolished in the 20th century post-war, weren't they? I mean, surviving areas where, you know, the southern part of the grid is demolished near Dolphin Square, isn't it, and cleared, and the new estates are laid out on Lupus Street. And,
yes.
And also on Datchbrook Street itself, one side of
yes, that's true. I mean, we are in a half street. We are in a half Cubitt Street, because the other side is this wonderful council development of about late 60s, which was really a model of its kind. It's very attractive to walk through. Again, curious enough, it's very like a sort of Italian hill town in concept. I'm told by local policemen that if you designed something for drug dealing, you couldn't have done better than this place with all these little nooks and corners and attractive sort of alleyways and things.
But it's become a very desirable place to live, hasn't it? A lot of the properties within it were sold off when council houses were sold off and are now privately owned. So it demonstrates its appeal in a way.
Yes, I think it's wonderful. I think that there's another one called Churchill Gardens, and that was built just after the Second World War. It was part of the Abercrombie plan, and there was an intention to replicate Churchill Gardens, which is a big housing estate of idealistically designed blocks of houses.
Yes.
So everybody had a view of the river, everybody had a bit of sun, and so on and so forth. But it was on a very big scale, and these were going to go
straight through Pimlico. And
no, across the whole of London.
Exactly.
We saw 48 or something.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it was incredible. Anyway, this was the only one that was done, I think. But I think that part of Pimlico, I don't think it was terraces. I think it might have been, these low industrial uses. I suspect.
So in fact, there were not the streets. I wouldn't know.
No, I don't think. I mean, the what's called the grid, the bit which Cubitt laid out as a grid, you know, on this funny street with its curve because of the noisome sewer, we're not in the grid. But the grid part is pretty intact.
It's worth saying that in London, a grid of any kind is quite unusual. I mean, you know, that again, that's when it was being built. This is strikingly different, and it does bestow a very different character. I mean, the length of the views through Pimlico along Belgrave Road, for example. I mean, they're quite exceptional. They're broken by the kink that divides Belgravia from Pimlico, but you know, once the canal, now the railway tracks. But there is something really remarkable about it, isn't it? That these long vistas. And of course, many of the high-rise buildings now intrude into those very long.
Yes, that's I think a great sadness for London, not just for our part of London, but for London as a whole. But Nine Elms Lane is quite a long way from here. But these enormous towers, none of which is distinguished architecturally in any way at all, invade the view that was previously, until 10 years ago, really, you know, the skyline was that of Cubitt, really. So that is a bit of a sadness. But I think Cubitt could be proud of the fact that the Mr. Cubitt's district, which was what this was called, has actually survived in pretty good heart. And I think that although it had these terrible episodes, I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, these terraces are very robust, and they've bounced back. People want to live in these houses, and now a lot of people do. The population here is much higher than it was in the year 2000, for example. So it's a sign of the enduring success of Cubitt's vision.
What a very nice point which to leave this. Thank you, Clive. What a fascinating tour.
Well, thank you, John.
Of Pimlico.
Thank you for listening to this, our first episode of the podcast, Your Places or Mine, Wipe on Pod for short. Our next episode will be about King Charles III and his love of architecture.